First up, we have Railroad Workers United representative with us. Ron Kaminkow is a locomotive engineer who has worked in freight and passenger service since 1998. He was first hired out of Chicago with Conrail as a brakeman in 1996, promoted to conductor in 97, and became a locomotive engineer the following year. In 2004, he went to work for Amtrak in Milwaukee and Chicago. He has run trains in 9 states over the rails of all of the Class 1 railroads. He also served as secretary of the Railroad Workers United beginning in 2008 and is now the union's general secretary. Please welcome Ron Kaminkow. Ron, thanks for coming on the show.
It's good to be here, Jimmy. Just make a quick correction. I am now the organizer for Railroad Workers United. Sorry about that.
So tell us what Railroad Workers United is. It's not a union, but it is an organization that brings together unions, right?
Correct. Unfortunately, on the railroads, we were early on to get organized. Railroading was one of the most dangerous occupations, even considered more dangerous than coal mining. So as a result, railroaders began to organize early, and the Brotherhood of Locomotive Engineers, of which I am a member today, was the first rail union to get organized in the 1860s. And they were quickly followed by the conductors, the brakemen, the telegraphers, and so forth and so on. And so this was a double-edged sword. Because we got organized early, we were organized by craft. It was only natural for workers who worked closely with each other in the same craft to organize along craft lines. Well, the CIO in the 1930s organized along industrial lines, but we missed that. We were already ossified by the Railway Labor Act into 26 different unions at one point we had on the railroad. It's been pared down to 12. But as it's easy for most people to understand, if you have a union in a workplace, and I usually give the example of a high school, for example, if you had a teachers union, but instead of having a teachers union, you had an art school teachers union, a gym teachers union, a music teachers union, and you get the idea. It's slightly absurd. And so there has been efforts over the years since the 1890s to unite all railroad workers into a powerful industrial union. Without going into too much detail, fast forward to 2006, and Railroad Workers United started to get organized. We had a founding convention in 2008. And our informal slogan is, even if we cannot be a single union, we can certainly act like one. We hold dear the principles of solidarity, unity, and democracy, and we believe in rank and file action. We're not going to be saved by union leaders. We're going to be saved by our own self-activity. So that's RW in a nutshell.
Okay, so that's because I made the mistake of thinking you were a union, and RWU is not a union. RWU is exactly what you just explained. So that's great. Now, the interesting thing is I want to cover this first, right? Because oftentimes the union leadership gets in bed with the people they're supposed to be organizing against, right? And they succumb to the company, and in this case, the railroad. And so the railroad union just ousted their president who backed the last labor deal. And so here's what I have. There's the information. Eddie Hall, a working engineer who pushed for more aggressive stance in the contract showdown, he won an upset victory to lead the major rail union called the BLET. It's a stunning upset. In June, the BLET took a strike vote, its first such national vote in over a decade. Members returning ballots voted 99.5% in favor of striking. That's the members of the BLET union. For months, the BLET and other unions had pushed for 15 paid sick days for rail workers. Currently, railroaders get none. In those final hours before their strike deadline on September 15th, the union agreed instead to accept 3 unpaid sick days with 30 days notice.
What?
Yeah, so you have to give a notice when you're going to be sick. I don't know how you do that.
Is that really what that means?
That's what that says, and that's what that means. And then that's going to be taken, and those sick days had to be taken on a Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday. So
Hey, great job, guys.
You
Getting that deal.
don't get sick Friday through Monday. That's what they're saying there. Okay, so that was the deal. So the head of the union, this guy Dennis Pierce, with Dennis Pierce standing next to him in the Oval Office, Joe Biden told the press they feel good. These guys, by the way, they're still standing, but they should be home in bed. 20 straight hours of negotiations. I want to thank business and labor.
Should have got those 30-day notice that they let them know.
So they could sit down. Pierce then advocated for his membership to support the deal. Contracts between the railroads and their employees have never had sick time, he said in a separate interview. There are a lot of industries that don't have that in their contracts. Asked if he would support the deal, Pierce replied, I probably would. Pierce was indeed able to get the contract ratified, but it may have cost him his job because the workers really didn't want that. But why? So how did they get that ratified then? If the workers didn't like it, and if they were so upset with that deal that they just threw him out, they just voted him out. So can you explain what happened there?
Yeah, it's pretty complicated. So we work under this thing called the Railway Labor Act, passed in 1926. And one of the things it gave to labor was the right to be recognized. Prior to this, no union had actually had legal sanction to exist. And so the union leadership at the time were quite excited about this idea that they would actually be recognized. But what was given up was things like the unadulterated right to strike. And railroad workers since the 1870s had been striking with reckless abandon. In fact, it caused the economy of this country a lot of strife and problems. And a lot of the smaller rail carriers wanted to sue for labor peace. So here comes 1926. We get saddled with the Railway Labor Act. And keep in mind the 12 different unions, all of which are tending to bargain separately, have a long history of fratricide. And so here we are today in a situation where workers are faced with a tentative agreement. They don't necessarily like it. In fact, 5 of the 12 unions voted the tentative agreement down. Those that actually voted in favor of it, it was by a fairly small margin. And so what you hear is railroad workers do not have the right to strike in this country. And that's not exactly true. I always tell people, no, we have the right to strike. The problem is under the RLA, the government has the right to order us back to work. So knowing this puts a damper on railroad workers' ability to fight. Knowing that you're going to, for example, in the machinists, the first union to settle for the tentative agreement, the rank and file voted it down. The leadership quickly repackaged it, added a bunch of rhetoric, not much substance, but basically they browbeat and encourage the members to vote for a contract saying, this is the best we're going to get. We'll get them next round. We're making progress. Hey, you don't want the government to control your destiny and order you back to work, do you? And hey, they could order you back to work on even worse terms if they so desire. And so through this, basically a lot of stick and a little teeny bit of carrot, they convince workers, and they did in the machinist case, to just barely get that 50% plus one. And so I think what we saw in the case of the BLET was a bunch of workers who haven't gone without a wage increase for 3 years. Just before Christmas, the ability to get a 3-year back pay lump sum check, and the understanding that, what are they going to do? Just repackage it and sell it to us again? Is the government going to force us back to work, possibly under worse conditions? What the hell? I'm throwing my hands up. In a perfect world, I would vote no, but a certain percentage vote yes. And so that's how these things pass. But interestingly, like that article pointed out, one thing that workers can do without fear of reprisal or losing money or et cetera, is to vote out their union officers. And that is exactly what happened, I would say, in the case of Dennis Pierce. That pent-up anger and frustration at not being able to win the contract that we thought we were capable of winning was taken out on the leadership. And so that's the end of Dennis Pierce.
So when 5 of the 12 unions voted down this contract, that was actually the majority of workers voted against it, right? Even though 7 unions may have voted for it, they had lower numbers than the 5 unions who. So the number of workers who voted down this was greater than the number of workers who voted for it. That's the case, right?
Yeah, we estimate from the numbers that we have that unions representing 55% of railroad workers who were party to the national agreement did vote no. And if you throw in the original machinist vote, it's more like 60%. But the machinists, like I say, were coaxed and cajoled into a second vote, and they in fact did vote in favor.
So there's been some debate, disingenuous debate, as far as I'm concerned. But let's put it. Let me run it past you. So about what the Democrats did and what they didn't do. So we know that Joe Biden and the Democrats forced an agreement on the rail workers and took away their ability to strike. So as far as I'm concerned, what the Democrats did was union bust. They broke your strike, right? And they wouldn't, so you can't do it legally. And you have to accept this. So to me, that's a version of fascism, when the government comes together with a corporation to screw the worker. Now, they could have forced an agreement that gave you sick leave. They didn't do that. They forced an agreement that screwed you. And so there's been a lot of controversy of whether the people, the Democrats in the squad, people like AOC and Cori Bush and Jamal Bowman, whether those people actually were supporting you or whether they weren't. Now, to me, it looks obvious that they weren't supporting you. They voted for the original agreement, which took away your ability to organize and strike. And so if the Democrats would have just done nothing in Congress, the railroad workers would be much better off because they would still have their ability to strike. And the reason why the government intervened and made it so you couldn't strike was because they and the company knew you would win that strike, and probably quickly, because you have the power. The people who are the glue holding our economy together are going to strike. We were going to get that strike fixed. And so right now what the president and the Democrats did was they interceded on behalf of the railroad company to screw the workers. Now, would you agree with that assessment?
I would. But the thing that we do have to understand, rail labor is extremely difficult to understand. And if we simply attempt to understand it in terms of, oh, we got friends in Congress and we have enemies in Congress, we're not going to understand the history of how rail labor has been treated. So I jotted down a few notes here prior to this. And so the first strike that was really huge was the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. It was a Republican president, Hayes, and he broke that strike, sent in the federal militia. Over 100 workers were killed, workers were blacklisted, and that was the end of that strike. Then we saw the Pullman strike. Democrat president Grover Cleveland stepped in, basically opposed to Eugene Debs and the American Railway Union. It was hurting the mails, they stated, was being interfered with. So on that pretext, once again, armed militia confiscated the files of the ARU and blacklisted members of the American Railway Union. Fast forward to 1922, the Great Shopman Strike, and you had President Warren Harding, once again a Republican, who intervened to break that strike. Now take 1946-47, the big post-war strike wave, the biggest strike wave in the history of the United States, where you had miners, steelworkers, and railroaders all striking. Truman, great Democrat, pro-labor president, threatened to break the strike by basically drafting all railroad workers into the armed forces. Then you had Bush and Reagan in the 80s and 90s, and now, of course, you have Biden in 2022. And so the reason I bring all of this up is, if we try to understand rail labor in terms of this personality, this specific politician, the squad, the Republicans in the Senate who actually voted in favor of sick time, we don't understand how complex this is. For example, 30 years ago was the last, quote, strike. It actually ended up being a lockout, a national lockout. The vote in Congress was 400 to 5 to basically send us back to work and break the strike. And so Democrats, Republicans, independents, libertarians, socialists, you name it, have a sordid history that when the capitalist state is threatened by something as intrinsic to its survival as a railroad workers' strike, they really do shake hands across the aisle. None of this actually surprised me in the least, knowing this history.
So, yeah, that's kind of the point of this show. The point of this show is to point out that you can get caught up in thinking that, as Joe Biden pretends he's the biggest pro-union president in history, and then he goes and screws you, just like the Democrats say they're socialists, and the squad says that they stand with workers, and of course they don't. And so this is bipartisan. It doesn't matter who's in power. The whole point of this show is to show that they serve the same people. The only difference between a Democrat and Republican is how fast their knee hits the ground when a donor enters the room, as was what Ralph Nader taught us a long time ago. So the point of this, the reason why I ask you this is because there has been some union leadership, I think, that are bullshitting people, and there's been some journalists that have been bullshitting people, along with politicians. Like the Democrats are trying to pretend that they did this for the workers. Joe Biden's trying to pretend he did it for the workers, and AOC is trying to pretend that she stood with the workers, and they all screwed the workers, right? And so, and then now we have this. So this is from the BMWED, and they're going out saying the only chance we had at obtaining sick leave was to pass both bills in the House. No, the best chance you had was if the Democrats did nothing. So that's a lie. I don't know why they would do that. That's not true. The best chance you had at getting sick leave is if the Democrats in Congress did nothing and let the workers work it out with the company and let the union do what they're supposed to do. That was the best chance. So right off the bat, they're lying. I don't know why they're doing that. And then they go on and say, without passing both, sick leave was sunk. Representative AOC voted for both measures because it was our only opportunity to advance sick leave and have a shot. AOC was always had our back, and we thank her. Now, that's not true. Why would they be lying to protect a politician? And is it because some of the union leadership is corrupted?
Well, there's a fatalism, on the part of most labor leaders, and not just railroad union leaders, although I would postulate that railroad union leaders are some of the most historically conservative union leaders. And that's partly because we don't have an industrial union. They're busy fighting each other, so that helps weaken them. And it's hard for rail labor leaders to take a forceful stance. And just like most labor leaders, there's this sense that the Republican Party is our enemy. So if they're our enemy, we pretty much by default have to support the Democrats. And yeah, they don't always support us. And in fact, they screw us a lot of the time. But it's the lesser of two evils philosophy that holds sway here. So
wow. That's and it's a bad philosophy, right? This is proven that it's a bad philosophy. What just happened proved that philosophy is a bankrupt philosophy, right?
Well, it's terrible because what we need to do as trade unionists is always emphasize the role of the rank and file, to emphasize the role of the membership. Without them, there is no union, there is no power. And so what do we do to get the members involved in the process? Well, unfortunately, when Section 6 notices were exchanged under the Railway Labor Act about this time 3 years ago, there was no fanfare. The members were not involved. They were not invited. And for 2.5 years, we got very little information. Bargaining is conducted behind closed doors in relative secrecy, and this is agreed to with the rail carriers. And every 6 months, the only update we get is that things are not going too well. We are never called upon to act. We are not called upon to have a national day of action in conjunction with, for example, other workers, other unions who are also facing oppression at the hands of their employers. We could do a national action with groups like the Sierra Club and other environmental organizations who understand how important and intrinsic rail is to a green economy. We could be courting these people and having this kind of mass coalition building where the workers are at the center of everything we do. But it's not that way. And I've also worked union outside of the rail industry, so I have a fairly broad understanding of unions in the private sector, public sector, and on the railroad. And the biggest letdown for me is that union leaders who say, hey, we got this. We got this. We're going to file a lawsuit. Hey, we're introducing legislation. Hey, we're lobbying this politician. Well, none of those things involve the members. None of those things actually bring forth the true power of the trade union. And that is where we're missing the boat. And my hope going forward is that we will never make such a blunderous mistake again as we made going into this round of bargaining.
What was the
Railroad
blunder?
Workers United is already moving forward in this whole idea of how to prepare to run a serious rank and file oriented campaign next round of bargaining in 2 years.
What was the blunder? What was the blunder you made going into this?
Into this round of bargaining?
Yes.
Cutting the rank and file completely out of the process.
Okay.
With the union leadership of the naive belief that they're going into bargaining with some of the most powerful corporations on Wall Street, corporations who have shown their unwillingness to compromise, to bend 1 inch, and to think that they are somehow skillfully, through language or banging their fists on the table or whatever the bargaining team wants to do, to really believe they're going to come out of it with a good contract without unleashing the power of the membership is just folly.
And so where does it stand right now? So the government came together quickly in a bipartisan manner to screw you and take away your ability to strike, which is your ability to organize. And so I was hoping that they would go ahead and strike anyway. Now, what is happening? Would that happen? And what is the state of negotiations? And what's the state with the workers?
Well, like I tell everybody, you can't organize an illegal strike. You can't organize a wildcat strike. Now, we've had examples of illegal strikes in this country. When I was growing up in Baltimore, the teachers union went on strike. We just had a teacher strike in West Virginia 4 or 5 years ago, in Oklahoma, Arizona. These were illegal strikes. Jimmy Carter instituted or invoked the Taft-Hartley Act in 1978 against the miners' union. The miners' union refused to go back to work. They violated the law. The thing is, the union and the membership were united in these cases. On the railroad, you do not have a union leadership that is ready, willing, and able to call for and carry out any kind of wildcat or illegal strike. And so if workers were to go out on illegal strike, they are not only opposing the federal government, all 3 branches of it, both political parties, some of the most powerful corporations in the world, but also their union leadership. So the idea that a wildcat strike is simply going to happen is probably not in the cards. Although I wouldn't rule out anything, because workers' anger can be quite deep and a specific incident can always take place and spontaneous walkouts can take place. But it's not going to be organized. Let's just put it that way. So right now, yeah, we're in this situation. It's largely over. There is hope held out that Biden can be pressured to issue an executive order which would grant 7 days of sick time. Apparently, Obama in 2015 did issue an executive order that granted sick time to all employees who were employed by federal contractors, but it exempted railroad workers. That loophole could be closed. We're wondering, why is there crickets? What's the silence? Can we do this or can we not? So that's kind of where we're at right now.
Go ahead, Kurt.
Why is that Obama thing where he exempted the railroads? Like, are the railroad tycoons that level of tycoon still, that they who are they paying off there to? Why would he possibly do that?
Why would Barack Obama make a special cutout for the railroads? What's special about them?
Yeah, right. Or is it like?
Yeah.
I mean, I know railroads important, but what
do they have more power than every other?
Yeah. Well, as we've talked about, they are extremely powerful and wealthy. And just as an update, everybody knows about the robber barons and back in the day, and that the rail industry ripped off the country to the tune of probably trillions of dollars and hurt industry, and had to be regulated by the Interstate Commerce Commission, which came about, I believe, in the 1890s. So fast forward to today, there is thought and speculation looking at the numbers that the rail industry is actually more profitable and is making more money than it ever has, even back in those robber baron days. So you're going up against some pretty tough customers here who obviously lobby both political parties, make their campaign contributions to Democrat and Republican alike, just like the coal companies used to do when I lived in Virginia. So there's that aspect, but then there is this sort of technical aspect that railroads and railroad labor operate under different laws. So for example, there's lots and lots of state laws that have been passed to stop long trains from blocking crossings, which is a danger to communities, so that police and fire cannot access the other side of town because the entire town's cut in half by a train that's been sitting there for 2 hours and it's 3 miles long. Well, guess what? Federal judges routinely rule these state and municipal laws unconstitutional because of the Commerce Clause of the U.S. Constitution that says only the federal government can regulate interstate commerce. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's all sorts of other laws that somehow exempt railroads and rail labor from certain legislation. But believe me, I'm not very political and don't know what those laws could be.
Okay, so how do you, what's the process? So now I know there's a push that to make the railroads a public utility, kind of, right? Under control by the public and the workers. Now, how does, that seems like that would never happen. How would something like that happen?
Well, yeah, I agree with you. And most people will say, you know, you're pipe dreaming. That's not going to happen. This is America. But I would postulate a few things we have going for us. And I'll state this. Railroad Workers United has discussed and debated this for over a decade. We do not take the decision lightly that we have come out in favor of public ownership of the railroads of this country. But it was a unanimous vote of our steering committee, which is drawn from ranks of all the different craft unions, and everybody on the committee is a working railroader. At this point, there is so much anger and discontent amongst railroad workers. There is unprecedented discontent amongst just about every single shipping group in this country. They are furious with the level of service. They're furious with demurrage fees. They're furious with the rates that have been jacked through the roof. And so, along with environmentalists who also understand that the rail industry is intrinsic to any kind of Green New Deal, any kind of greener economy, and yet the rail industry is moving less freight than we did 16 years ago. Profits are up, the stock price is through the roof, dividends are up, CEO pay is up, and of course so are prices on the shippers. Service is down, railroad employment is down up to some estimates 30% in the last 5 years. And so we have this situation where the rail industry really has angered and pissed off just about everyone in the country except the stockholders. And so we quickly realized if this is ever going to happen, now is a golden opportunity because the railroad doesn't really have a whole lot of friends.
And so that would take an act of Congress that would need to be signed by the president, right?
Of course.
Okay. So we don't live in a democracy. We live in an oligarchy, and that's not hyperbole. And the proof of it is that you're not allowed to strike, and you're not even allowed to have sick days. And you are the glue that holds our economy together. And so that shows you that the only way our government works nowadays is if it's in the motion of corruption. So if it'll never work in the motion of helping the people. That's why we can send $100 billion to the most corrupt country in Europe, Ukraine, while we won't send $100 billion to Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, Houston, Atlanta, Miami to fix the homelessness problem. We can we can do that. So that's because that's corruption. That $100 billion isn't going to the people of Ukraine. It's going to the military-industrial complex and every other grifter who's got their hands in the pocket of the U.S. Treasury. So that's why that gets done. But to help workers or to help homeless homeless people or to help actual Americans, that's not going to happen because our government is just that corrupt. That's what people don't realize. They think our government is regular corrupt. It's not. It's completely corrupted 100% on a massive scale, and it has been that way since 1980, which is why workers haven't had a raise since 1980, and 80% of workers live paycheck to paycheck already before COVID, and half the country can't afford a $500 emergency. And that's because your government was taken from you, not on January 6th. Your government was taken from you decades ago, and it is by corporations. They do it right out in the open. That's why Barack Obama's entire cabinet was already handpicked by an email that came from Citigroup. That's who's running your country. The military-industrial complex, Citigroup, the railroad companies, that's who's running your country, not the goddamn people you vote for. They're the tools of those people. This is not a democracy. And what's happened with the railroad is exact proof of that. Everybody in the country wants railroad workers to get sick leave, and they're not getting it. Why? Because we're ruled by a handful of billionaires, which is called an oligarchy, which is why everything they say about January 6th is complete bullshit, that it's to distract you from the real takeover of our government that happened. Why aren't the Democrats screaming about Citizens United anymore? Because they were supposed to overturn it. They were supposed to pass a law and get rid of it. They're not going to ever get rid of it because they work for the same goddamn people who got rid of Citizens. They are the people. There's only one party in America, and it's the money party. And so, all right, that's my speech. We have to move along. Is there anything that you'd like to add before we go, Ron?
Yeah, just a little bit. I mean, first, I don't disagree with you, Jimmy, but quoting one of the founding members of Railroad Workers United, the first step to the solution to any problem is optimism. And so, not to be naive, but I do believe things can change, or I would, as my dad used to say, blow my brains out. I do think things can change. And on the question of public ownership of the railroads, the rail industry in this country is an anomaly. The idea that this is somehow quintessentially American or a glorious free enterprise is nonsense. Because if you look at the rest of the public or the transportation infrastructure of the country, the public owns the seaports. The public owns the airports. The public owns the inland waterways, of which massive millions of tons go up and down the Mississippi, the Ohio, the Missouri. It's all publicly owned and funded. The interstate highway system, the county road system, old U.S. highways, all once again funded publicly. Now, let's look at the rest of the world. Railroads all over the world, the infrastructure, regardless of whether the companies who are actually moving the trains, both freight and passenger, might be private companies. But the infrastructure in Japan and China and Romania and Germany and Sweden and Poland and Spain and France and England is all owned publicly. And so my point here is that the U.S. rail industry is the odd duck. The U.S. rail industry is the anomaly. The U.S. industry is a farce and a charade. It's moving less freight than it did a generation ago. It refuses to double track main lines. It refuses to electrify. And all it wants to do is cut costs, lay off workers, reduce service, and increase prices. And so there's a lot of ammunition out there for the American people to galvanize and come together and rebuild the railroad system in this country publicly. And it can serve to unite the country. We operate in all 48 states. It could be the basis of a great public movement.
I would love to see it happen. I've been wondering what is going to be the match that sets off the wave of revolution in America. I thought it was starting when Christian Smalls organized a bunch of Trumpers in Staten Island to rise up as a union against Amazon. And now Starbucks are starting to unionize all across the country. And you notice how that doesn't get any press and how they have to squash that right away. So, this railroad, if you were allowed to strike, that would have also sent a message to the rest of the labor unions in America and all the rest of the workers, and it would have energized them. So that's another reason why they had to stop this. Well, I wish the railroad workers would somehow find a way to unite and find a way to shut down the economy so we could make the railroad system a public utility. That would be fantastic. That would go a long way. And I would certainly I would go out and march. I would help publicize those marches. I would help rally people. I would do whatever I could. So So what when I see stuff like this, when I see a union pretending that a politician is helping them, is delaying what we need to have happen. So that's the lie, right? So that's why the idea that there's somebody in government working for you. There is no one in government working for you. And so that's why that lie is so insidious by that union, to pretend that there's somebody in government working for you when there isn't. So as soon as the workers realize that nobody in government is there to work for you, the faster we can get to that point where we can all rise up and use our power, our collective power, to shut things down. And that's what has to happen in America, because we're already, again, those aren't made up statistics, that 80% of workers live paycheck to paycheck, that half the country can't afford a $400. Those aren't made up. Half of all wage earners earn $30,000 or less. This in the richest country in America. This is a failed system that we're living under. We're the richest country in the world, and half of the country is poor or low income. It's a failed system. And railroad workers, who are the glue to our economy, can't even get a sick day. This is a failed system. And so the idea that there's somebody in either political party there to help you, that is just there to delay what needs to happen. And I'm with you. So I would love to see the railroad workers come together and rise up, and then maybe we would see other workers and come together and rise up. Maybe the truckers would rise up. Maybe all the UPS. Who knows what would happen? But we saw with the essential workers, the power of the essential workers, the real people who keep this country going. We saw during COVID. It's not the CEOs in business. It's not middle managers. It's people on the ground doing the work at railroads. There's truckers. It's people in grocery stores. It's people stocking those shows. Those are the essential workers. We don't treat them like they're essential. We still funnel all the money up to the people at the boardrooms. And so as soon as those essential workers realize that they actually are essential and take that power that they have intrinsically and then express it, until then, we're going to be stuck living like Brazil. But the faster that can happen. And so what would help make that happen is bullshit fucking leaders of unions would quit pretending that AOC or any other goddamn Democrat or Republican is on your side, because that is them gaslighting you. Okay, I've said my piece. We got to run. Thanks for coming on, Ron, and good luck. I hope you organize some kind of an action and come back on and tell us about it.
All right. Well, thanks, Jimmy. And if I could give a shameless plug for the organization, if anybody's interested in the work we're doing, go to our website, railroadworkersunited.org.
Hey, we're doing live stand-up comedy in Los Angeles, December 9th, 16th, 23rd, and 30th. And we're going to be in Tempe, Milwaukee, Minneapolis, Nashville. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for all those tickets. See you there.